In 2.7, you need to go back to your algebra skills and remember what transitive and the substitution properties are. If you remember what the transitive property it is if we have A congruent to B and B congruent or equal to C, then we know that A is going to be congruent or equal to C. Basically, by taking out the middleman. You can kind of think of this as our chain reasoning. And that brings us to our first theorem in this section. If angles or segments are congruent to the same angle or segment, then they are congruent to each other. Think of it this way. If we know that angle A is going to be congruent to angle B, and we know that angle B is congruent to angle C, then we can basically do the transitive property saying that angle A will be congruent to angle C. So if we have, this is A, this is B, and this is C, and if we know, let's just think of angles, if this is 30 degrees, and this is 30 degrees, we know that A is going to be congruent to B. And if we know that B is congruent to C, again being 30 degrees, we can just kind of take out the middleman to say that A will be congruent to angle C. Very similar to that, we have theorem 17. If angles or segments are congruent to congruent angles or segments, then they are congruent to each other. This is basically a series of substitution. Let's look at the example with the following givens. Angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, angle 3 is congruent to angle 4, and angle 1 is congruent to angle 3. And what can you prove from this? Through a series of substitutions, you can prove the following. Substituting in for 1, you can prove that angle 2 is congruent to angle 3. And from there, you can do another substitution that angle 4 and angle 2 will be congruent to each other, substituting in with angle 4. So again, through a series of substitutions, we can prove that angle 2 is congruent to angle 4. Let's look at the following examples. Given angle OMP is congruent to RPM, MP bisects angle OMR, and PM bisects angle OPR, given the following diagram. Basically, two triangles stacked on top of each other. We can label the following diagrams based on the given OMP congruent to RPM, and then we can start our proof. We can start our proof with the three givens, and again, the reasoning being simply that they were given in the beginning of the statement. From there, though, looking at number 2 and number 3, that MP bisects OMR, we can come to the conclusion that angle OMP is congruent to angle PMR, and angle MPR is congruent to angle OPM. The reasoning, if a ray bisects an angle, then it divides it into two congruent angles. From there, we can say angle OMP is congruent to OPM. The reasoning, if angles are congruent to congruent angles, then they are congruent. Again, that basic substitution We can do the same substitution reasoning with angle PMR is congruent to angle MPR. Again, same reasoning. We can then go to our conclusion. Angle OMR is congruent to angle OPR. And that reasoning being, if congruent angles are added to congruent angles, then their sums are congruent.